Tonight, Donald Trump threatens to sue the BBC for $1 billion. The US president says he'll go ahead with legal action if he doesn't get a retraction, an apology and compensation. The BBC have got until Friday night to respond. It comes after the BBC's chairman apologises for an error of judgment for the way a Panorama documentary edited a speech made by Mr. Trump. The corporation's outgoing news CEO insists it's not part of a bigger problem with bias.
I stepped down over the weekend because the buck stops with me. But I'd like to make one thing very clear. BBC News is not institutionally biased.
Tonight we'll talk about suggestions of boardroom coups, alleged bias and the future of the UK's national broadcaster. Also ahead, a fresh row over hundreds of thousands of pounds of donations to the new political party set up by Zara Sultana and Jeremy Corbyn. We've got exclusive new details. And Robert Jenrick uses AI to mock the Deputy Prime Minister David Lammy, all part of the rough and tumble of modern politics or a flagrant breach of Parliament rules we'll be debating. Well, all that and more with our definitely always rule-abiding duo tonight, Kit O'Harry and Sonia Soda, who'll be with us for the next hour. It's Monday, I'm Darren McCaffrey, live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. A very good evening. Tonight we begin with the crisis engulfing the BBC, which has deepened this evening with President Trump threatening to sue the corporation for $1 billion over the way it edited one of his speeches. It comes despite an apology from the BBC's chairman over the way Panorama spliced together sections of a speech to make it appear that the US president had urged violent action from his supporters in the hours before January 6th riots. The row has already led to the resignations of both the BBC Director General Tim Davie and the head of news Deborah Turness. Our arts and entertainment correspondent Katie Spencer has tonight's top story.
Resignations, rumours of a coup, and now a looming legal threat. If things weren't bad enough at New Broadcasting House following the resignation of Director General Tim Davie and his news CEO Deborah Turness,
we're going to walk down and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down.
cue confirmation that US President Donald Trump is so enraged by how his speech was doctored in this episode of Panorama, he's now threatening to sue. This, a copy of the letter sent on his behalf, the last line of which saying, if the BBC doesn't retract the programme and apologise by November the 14th at 5 p.m, President Trump will be left with no alternative but to enforce his legal and equitable rights by filing legal action for no less than $1 billion in damages. The BBC, it says, is on notice. Today, a written apology to MPs from the chair, Samir Shah, one of the last men standing, as he spoke to his own news channel about what went wrong.
The apologising is for the way the team edited President Trump's speech to his supporters on January the 6th.
The chain of events which has upended things within the BBC was triggered by a memo from Michael Prescott, a former external advisor to the BBC's Editorial Standards Committee, raising concerns about institutional bias over Gaza, gender identity and immigration issues.
All these stories and issues that Mr. Prescott raises have been considered at the committee. In fact, indeed, that's how he knows about them, because he's a member of the advisory. So I don't think it's fair to characterise it as some kind of uncovery. Secondly, there's also an impression given that we've listened to these concerns and we've done nothing. And that is also not an accurate representation of both what Mr. Prescott says and what the BBC has done.
We heard nothing from the Director General and his news CEO in the days after the memo went to press. And while there was no sign of Davie in his office, Turness entered by the front door saying this.
I would like to say it has been the privilege of my career to serve as the CEO of BBC News and to work with our brilliant team of journalists. I stepped down over the weekend because the buck stops with me. But I'd like to make one thing very clear. BBC News is not institutionally biased. That's why it's the world's most trusted news provider.
So what exactly has been going on inside of New Broadcasting House? Sky News understands that Deborah Turnus had wanted to get a statement out early last week, but was blocked by the BBC board, which was arguing over the wording. Now, some of the BBC's own journalists have gone on the record to say what we're actually seeing play out now goes back much further than the last week, with claims that within the BBC there are those who have systematically set out to undermine Tim Davie and his senior leadership for a long time now, a coup being the implication from within the BBC board. Former senior insiders say the corporation's problems extend beyond the boardroom.
I think we're now seeing that there was, of course, the leaks to the Telegraph, and some of the campaigning inside the BBC probably does have a degree of political motivation. But then equally, we know this year that Lisa Nandy, the Labour Culture Secretary, seemed at one point to be trying to get Tim Davie fired. And the fact is the BBC always has these political cross currents, and it's got to withstand them.
A national broadcaster without a leader and facing $1 billion threat. Sounding like a plot from one of its dramas, a very real problem the BBC now faces. Katie Spencer, Sky News.
Well, as we've just been hearing, the US President Donald Trump is threatening legal action against the BBC. Let's go live now to Washington, join our US correspondent James Matthews, who's there for us. James, and actually the BBC chairman alluded to this earlier on today, saying that Mr. Trump is a pretty litigious man. What is the realistic prospect that he may well take this legal action?
I think there's every prospect, Darren, given that this is a president, remember, who has smelled money in media companies, pursued it legally, and got a result. Not for the first time. Trump is chasing after a media organisation who has transgressed. Remember, ABC and CBS were once targets of his, and he walked away with compensation settlements of $15 and $16 million. I suppose that may be a guide to the kind of amount that we're talking about when he talks about compensation from the Beeb. His argument is that the BBC trashed his reputation. His lawyers are saying this Panorama programme was designed to deliberately denigrate him, showed a reckless disregard for the truth, they say. They make the point that millions saw it worldwide, and they're saying it caused the president overwhelming financial and reputational harm. Now, they've laid out their demands in a letter to the BBC chair. They want a full and fair retraction of the documentary, an apology, which they've already got, and they say they want compensation for harm caused. If they don't get it by the close of play this Friday, they say they're going to sue for $1 billion, and the letter ends rather darkly. The BBC is on notice, full stop. This is, Darren, the action of a president who does lean into the media, or lean on the media, like none has before. Routinely, Donald Trump rails against outlets for negative coverage, and he covets those organisations that are more sympathetic to him. And that, I suppose, is the bigger picture in all of this. The Trump narrative being that critical coverage amounts to fake news. A mistake on this scale, I suppose, threatens to undermine scrutiny of the White House at a time, perhaps, when scrutiny has never been more important.
Yeah, indeed, James. And also the time, of course, in which the BBC is trying to make some inroads into the United States in terms of broadcasting from there, seen as a bit more of an independent force. That may well also be damaged by the saga. As always, a pleasure, James. Thank you very much indeed. James Matthews there in Washington, D.C. Well, there's been plenty of political reaction, of course, back here in the UK as well. Let's have a listen into what some of our politicians on this side of the pond have been saying.
I think its output is very trusted. And again, when I'm speaking to people who've got very strongly held views on those, they're still using the BBC for a lot of their information, for that's forming their views on this. I think we can all point to elements of BBC broadcasting, of news, and say, well, that reflects my views and that doesn't. And that's absolutely right.
This is not an issue that is of the left or of the right. All of us want truth, and understanding the facts need to be true is a critical reform that we need to see within the BBC. I have been very, very distressed to see a lot of people think that their personal opinions are what is correct rather than what is the truth.
Look, the BBC needs to deal with the criticisms. I've had criticisms the way the BBC has given far too much coverage for Nigel Farage and reform. So we can have criticism of the BBC, but within that we need to recognise how valuable an institution it is.
The BBC has been institutionally biased for decades. Net zero, climate change, all their interpretation of the horrors that have happened in Gaza, and now, of course, the United States president.
Nigel Farage speaking a little earlier on today. Well, as you can see, our political correspondent Rob Powell is in the studio, as is my delightful panel, former number 10 Director of Communications, Gitta Harry, and the journalist and broadcaster, Sonia Soda. A very good evening to you all. Rob, let's start with you if we can, because we've heard quite a lot of criticism there, not least of all from Nigel Farage. That is perhaps unsurprising. Is it also unsurprising that actually the governments have been quite supportive of the BBC? You'd feel this could be a much worse crisis if there had been another party in power.
Absolutely. You don't get any sense that there was any pressure coming from the government for these big resignations yesterday. In fact, Lisa Nandy, the Culture Secretary, was out on the telly yesterday morning saying that pretty much she had confidence in what Tim Davie was doing. 10 hours later, he was gone.
I know politicians have got a track record of normally saying when you've got confidence in someone, they resign, but not normally when it comes to the BBC.
Yeah, it was. I think they only found out just before these resignations went public as well. Crucially as well, where they're coming down on this debate that's been playing out today about whether what happened, these errors within the BBC, whether they are individual errors or whether there is something more systemic going on across the BBC, it's very clear that the government thinks the former. The Prime Minister spokesperson was asked today whether the PM thinks that the BBC is institutionally biased and said explicitly no. Clearly there are other parties in Westminster who disagree with that. The Tories saying today and Reform that there needs to be some sort of bigger overhaul essentially. So there's a lot of politics in this. You saw from those clips, parties pretty much lining up along kind of left-right political lines on this. I don't think that means that this is just all froth and political noise, though. There are big issues of substance for the BBC here at a very crucial time for the corporation as well.
Yeah, indeed, and we will come on to that in a minute, particularly ahead, of course, of charter renewal. Sonia, I mean, BBC Crisis, I mean, I don't know how many times that's been on what we call a strap at the bottom of the screen over the years. Normally it's also on the BBC quite routinely. How much of a crisis is this?
I think it is pretty serious for the broadcaster. So I think when you take a step back from the fray, there is this very serious issue with that Panorama documentary, and that's what's really sort of put it on all the headlines because you've had Trump and the White House weighed in. But if you look at that leaked memo that went to the BBC board that was reported in The Telegraph, it identified a number of issues where it isn't just a single instance. So on some of the most hotly contested issues of the time, so I'm thinking about sex and gender, the clash between women's rights and trans rights, and Israel-Gaza, the memo identified clear issues that I think indicate systemic issues. Now, that doesn't mean that the BBC's journalistic output is institutionally biased across the piece. In fact, I think most of what the BBC produces is excellent and meets high standards of impartiality. But when you've got sort of the most contested issues of our time, and sex and gender is an issue I've written about a lot as a journalist, there is no question in my mind, having followed their coverage, it has been biased. It has started from a really partisan starting point that ignores the views of many of the British public, which is that women's spaces deserve protecting and they are not open to self-identification from men. So when you've got that shows that there is a cultural issue, and the BBC really needs to sort it out, because when it's getting it wrong on a couple of hot-button issues, it undermines trust in all of the BBC's output, and that's not fair on BBC journalists, and it's not fair on the public.
Gitto, I called you a broadcaster earlier on. Of course, you spent a lot of your career at the BBC itself. What's your sense on all of this?
Well, nearly 2 decades, and I'm very proud of that. And the BBC rightly has an extremely privileged position, able to sort of come into the living rooms of all of us or be on our car radio or wherever you get it these days, and be funded by compulsory tax, essentially. And with that privilege comes an enormous responsibility, which, on the whole, every person I've worked with at the BBC takes that very seriously. But some people these days don't. And I think, to your point about the trans kind of lobby, they have become very loud and influential within the BBC, and that has encouraged
Just on that
groupthink.
note, and I'm not defending the BBC per se here, but it's also, and I'm not going to get involved in the actual issue itself. It's a whole other argument we'd have another day. But there was a period of time over the last 5 years, 10 years ago, 10 years, where that was true of lots of institutions and lots of big companies. BBC was not alone in that.
The BBC has to be held to a higher standard than companies because the BBC is publicly funded, as Guito just said, and impartiality is the raison d'etre of the BBC. So I support a publicly funded BBC, but if it ends up being captured as easily as the next institution, the argument for the BBC disintegrates. So it's not good enough to say it happened to lots of other institutions too. We hold the BBC to a higher standard. But there was also the BBC, quite rightly.
I think it's about 6,000 to 7,000.
No, absolutely.
I think it's about 6,000 to 7,000 journalists, though. I mean, there's little evidence that there was a kind of, an institutional kind of diktat from above.
No, but what people have clearly sort of shared with Michael Prescott is that they feel uncomfortable. When a story comes up that involves trans rights, they actually don't cover the stories that reflect badly on that sort of pressure group, and they do cover the ones that reflect well on it. So it's not that people are literally spouting propaganda that's wrong. It just affects the agenda. And that's where, despite the fact that I think most of the correspondents are 100% robustly impartial and professional, but again, there's a sort of default to a sort of soft left view of the world. That profit is generally a bad thing, not a sign of success. It's seen to be companies exploiting customers. There's a default to, a number of issues across the board.
Are you comfortable, though, that the criticism that may well have led to this memo has come from the right? Because that's the argument. We've heard it from several people, including what's been said inside the BBC today, that, that this is not a coincidence.
Well, one thing I will say is I'm on the left. I'm a left-wing feminist who's written on these issues. I agree with the Prescott memo. I really think the people who are saying the critics of the BBC are all from the right, there are all these conspiracy theories, people who want to bring the BBC down, they are wrong and they are playing into their opponent's hands. Friends of the BBC, like us, who want it to succeed, are saying to the BBC, it's very clear from your output you've got an issue here. They can't just bury their heads in the sand because it isn't just the right, it's people from the left.
And I think the coup today, the idea today that there was a coup, the BBC reported this as a coup, is so missing the point.
Well, but the problem is, the BBC didn't report it as a coup. It said there were certain
people, but they gave a lot of prominence to that view. And basically, even if there are people on the right who want to destroy the BBC, it's not the point. What the BBC needs protection from at the moment is from itself.
Okay.
It needs to rediscover its best.
There is a lot to talk about this, but we have spoken to lots of people about it as well, and I do want to bring in Damien Collins now, a former chair, of course, of the Culture, Media and Sports Committee. I spoke to him a little bit earlier. What's your view on what's gone on over the last 24 hours or so?
Probably inevitable that we'd see those resignations at the BBC. I think it's a failure of their governance structures themselves, their failure to enforce their editorial policies, to take action when they hear something has gone wrong. It's a consistent pattern of behaviour we've seen over a decade and has led to the downfall of several Director-Generals now. So that's something the BBC have to take on board. I think reputationally, this is a very challenging time for them. It's a market where increasingly people aren't paying their licence fee, not because they are protesting against it, but because they're choosing to go elsewhere. So for all of our public broadcasters here, trust in standards and policies is really important to maintain those viewers.
And we'll get onto those big issues in a second. Just specifically on what happened with that Panorama programme.
Yeah.
Do you think on that alone, the Director-General and the Head of News should have resigned? Do you view that incident as serious enough?
No, I don't. I think they made a terrible mistake on a very important subject broadcast at an important time, just for an election. So that is a very serious matter. Did that Panorama programme misrepresent Donald Trump's speech and his intentions that day? I don't think he did. I think there's a case to be made that he was inciting that crowd. He was challenging the Congress to overturn the result of the US presidential election and to march on the Congress to put a bit of backbone in their representatives there to do just that. And I think the editing of that film was irresponsible, But you look at the whole speech, watch the whole speech, did it misrepresent what he said? No, I think the failure of the BBC...
He's called it a perfect speech and would deny that, obviously.
Yeah, but he would, but I think it was a highly irresponsible speech that led to a terrible action.
So why do you think...
And people's deaths.
Why do you think they have resigned then?
I think this is one of a series of failures now of editorial policy. And I think with the Trump documentary, the Panorama film, they didn't grip that straight away. They should have addressed that straight away. They should have made clear where they'd gone wrong, who would be responsible for that. And if they felt they could stand by the rest of the programme, then they should have done that. But not to address it, allow this to build, alongside other mistakes, like with the Gaza documentary as well, other complaints that have been made about them. I think it's led to what it's not just about one incident, it's a failure of governance and a failure of trust in the people that are running the organisation.
What do you make of these suggestions that it's actually part of a politically concerted campaign, maybe inside the board itself, to change either the direction or the management of the BBC?
Well, I think the Director General has got a lot of power within the organisation, and I don't believe anyone could stop him speaking about an incident that had taken place or an issue that had to be addressed. So I don't know why the board seems to have failed in this in this particular case, who might be responsible for that, but ultimately the buck stops with the Director General, and I think he should have stepped in.
We're talking about governance, and we talk about those allegations of political interference. I mean, is it right that some BBC board members are appointed? I mean, this is, of course, our national broadcaster. You're right, the BBC charter renewal is set by the government, but it's meant to have editorial independence, and yet some BBC board members are appointed by the government of the day.
Well, the BBC does have editorial independence because the Director General is the Editor-in-Chief. The board can question him on editorial decisions post-transmission, but the board isn't involved in making those decisions about what goes on air. So it does have editorial independence, led by the DG. It's then a question of what is the balance of the board. The board is supposed to be like an internal governance mechanism on which the government appoints some members, but there are plenty of executive members of that board and independent members as well. So I think because the government is responsible for the BBC through the charter, payment of the licence fee is required in law, I think it's right that there should be some government representation.
Do you think BBC News is institutionally biased?
It depends what you mean by that. Does it have a political point of view? Does it skew always one way rather than the other?
Well, I think that's the allegations that certainly made in this memo and elsewhere.
I don't believe it does. I believe over the years it's offended governments of all colours and probably will. And generally, probably the government of the day, whoever it is, has always complained about the BBC. I think what it shows here is, are there failures of process whereby when there's a problem, it tends to go into its bunker and defend its own first, whether that was over the Princess Diana interview on Panorama, whether that was the handling of who knew what when about Jimmy Savile, even to an extent on the action taken with regards to Hugh Edwards. Is there a trend of behaviour which is when things are very difficult and sensitive, they try to protect their own and hope it goes away? And I think that is where confidence has been lost.
Talking about the governance of the BBC, and there is going to be now another Director General. I mean, many of them have resigned over the years. It does seem like it's almost essentially an impossible job. Is it now a time where there actually is a head of the BBC who looks after its interests in terms of the future of broadcasting, its commercial rights, the brand of the BBC, the £6 billion budget and all that sort of stuff, and then someone else who is ultimately the Editor-in-Chief? Because, I mean, it's a big, big task.
Ultimately, if you run a media company, you are responsible for it. You are the publisher, you are the person at the top, the place where the buck stops. You could divide it, the BBC, you could ease the DG of some of the responsibilities. So the responsibility for some of the commercial decision-making and deal-making doesn't always rest with them. But whatever job titles you give people, someone is responsible at the top. And when things go wrong, that person is responsible for initiating whatever inquiries and reviews need to take place. If there's been a consistent failure over the last couple of years at the BBC, it would be when things were known about that had gone wrong, did the executive follow up in the appropriate way? And ultimately, the person at the top has to take responsibility for that.
Is the BBC, is an institution that's meant to reflect Britain, and in many ways, some might argue it reflects it all too well. In essence, that all the things we're talking about here are a kind of reflection of Britain, whether it's kind of failed institutions and governance or whether it is a fractured and polarised country that doesn't seem to agree on very much at the moment.
But that's why I think we need the BBC to pull itself together. because we need the BBC to be a functioning institution in this country. It's an important part of our independent media. And I'd say independent media companies, be it BBC, Sky, ITV and the newspapers, find themselves under institutional attack, I would say, from populist voices and politicians that don't like traditional media or don't like the scrutiny and the accountability that comes through it. So we need to defend our media as part of our democracy. We need the BBC to be robust and strong. But to do that, it's not about passing an act of parliament. It's about the licence fee payers having confidence in the institution. And if they don't, they will go elsewhere. And that is the real existential threat the BBC faces. It's not over what's decided in Parliament. It's over whether people think the licence fee is worth paying.
And just very finally on that, do you believe the BBC will exist beyond 2027 and in its current form?
Yes, I do beyond 2027. In its current form, is the BBC...
by the way, is the charter renewal, just to get people to know.
Is it sustainable being run in the way it is at the moment? I don't think that it probably is, And of course, people say, well, get rid of the licence fee, but would people want to see a fully commercial BBC running adverts? That would drain money from the other public broadcasters and companies like Sky. So it's a very balanced ecology. But I think the big challenge for the BBC beyond 2027 is, can it continue to do the breadth of things it does, run as many channels and services as it does? Is that sustainable with the funding it has?
OK, maybe a smaller BBC. Damien Collins, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. OK, you're watching the Politics Hub here on Sky News. Up next, we'll have more on that unfolding crisis at the BBC. I'll be getting the thoughts from an experienced former editor at the corporation about what's gone wrong and what needs to change next.
She was beautiful, she was bright, she had so much potential.
This wasn't an accident. Those individuals that didn't do their job properly, as far as I'm concerned, Nick, they need to be in a dock.
I don't know why a local authority would be trying so hard to avoid scrutiny.
Is cover-up too strong?
I don't think it is. The evidence is there. Nanita should never have died.
I've just got so many questions, and I'm not the only one.
What might happen if Russia attacked the UK?
This is clearly an enormous show of force.
It is definitely out of the ordinary.
We ran a war game with former ministers back in the hot seat.
Ben Wallace.
Amber Rudd.
Jack Straw.
It's the kind of war game that's genuinely tested inside government.
The Russians are signalling that there may be an attack.
Russia knows our weaknesses, but do you? I'm Deborah Haynes. From Sky News and Tortoise, this is The War Game. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to the Politics Hub here on Sky News. Now, we've been discussing, of course, that crisis at the BBC today. And for more on this, I did get the thoughts of Rob Burley, who spent many years at the corporation, including as the editor of live political programmes. He's more recently worked here at Sky News too. And here's what Rob had to say. Rob, very good evening to you. I mean, it's not every day that the head of BBC News resigns. It's certainly not every day that the Director General resigns. And it's definitely not every day that you get both resignations on the same day. What did you make of the last 24 hours?
Well, we always knew the BBC was good at drama, didn't we? You know, I guess they delivered on that front with this. Yeah, very dramatic. I mean, really serious stuff. I mean, I think, yeah, it was a culmination of a long time, lots of problems that had been building up that never seemed to be quite sorted. This is kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. But, I mean, I did think, you know, that the case of the Trump edit was pretty problematic, not least because it seems that the edit was brought to the attention of senior people at the BBC and, you know, pointed out to them exactly what happened, and they defended it. So that was kind of strange. So, yeah, it was dramatic and serious.
Dramatic and serious, but you alluded to it there. Your sense is that this was the straw that broke the camel's back, rather than this just individual incident involving Trump, that there's been a series of incidents, you're saying, over the last couple of years.
Of course. I mean, if you remember the Gary Lineker one, I mean, that was a point when it really felt like the authority that was sort of draining away from Tim Davie, and he had to sort of march up the top of the hill and then come back down again and again give in to Gary Lineker because his colleagues in sport weren't going to take it. And, you know, his writ didn't really run. So, I mean, the thing is, he talked a lot about some things that are important, like impartiality, but, you know, the problems just kept coming. So you never really felt anything had happened apart from a speech.
What do you make of this suggestion that's come from some, it must be said, even inside the BBC, suggesting that there was, or there is, a concerted political campaign? Some have branded it a coup in order to get rid of, I think, particularly Deborah Turness, but maybe Tim Davie too. Do you give those suggestions credence?
I think, you know, I think what is true is that there are plenty of forces outside the BBC who'd like to see the BBC, you know, either not be diminished or disappear. I mean, so that's true.
What about those inside the BBC, Rob?
Well, you know, I mean, I don't have any evidence for that, and I think it's a very strange thing to be focusing on for people who are, you know, have to grapple with what we've seen are real, unquestionably, you know, serious problems, to look for some kind of explanation beyond the actual mistakes themselves. I think, or errors, or maybe not mistakes, errors is maybe not the right word, maybe, you know, just bad sort of choices and bad behaviour journalistically. So to try and, you know, slightly camouflage that by saying it's all to do with an internal thing, I don't know we've seen any evidence for that. It's sort of all supposition and whispers and things. Where's the evidence that that's the case? This memo has got evidence in it about things going wrong. So I think, you know, that seems to be the focus. If there is evidence of it, then, you know, let's see it.
Well, indeed, but I'm only suggesting this because some BBC presenters themselves have suggested this on air. But as you said, they don't seem to have much evidence. So let's move on to, I think, the bigger, more concerning claim for the BBC, something that Deborah Turness denied as she was going into work today, is this idea of institutional bias inside the BBC. You worked at the BBC for a long time. You still know a lot of people who do work there. Do you think it's institutionally biased?
Okay, so I think it does have broadly speaking, a slightly left-leaning kind of profile in terms of the attitudes of the people that work there. So that's not a great surprising thing to say really about the BBC. I think it's probably true. It felt like that to me, but it doesn't mean those people didn't successfully sort of leave that behind at the door, because the vast majority of those I've ever worked with absolutely did. But we do see certain areas.
Can I just pick up on that, Rob? Sorry to interrupt. You say that that's unsurprising. Why is it unsurprising? And also, why is it? Why do you think the BBC is slightly left-leaning?
Well, I think it's unsurprising in the sense I remember Andrew Marr, when he first joined the BBC, getting into a bit of trouble for stating it as well at an event, because I think people outside it sort of, accept that it's the kind of people who are motivated to go there tend to come from a certain background or a certain perspective on the world. But as I say, I don't think those are unchanging attitudes. They may change over time, but also the vast majority was, when I was there, my views were, I wasn't interested in, my views being promoted. I was interested in impartially covering stories. if when you're at the BBC, you should love impartiality. It should be an absolute passion, and most people that's the case. So I'm not really saying they act on it. I'm saying that if I'm honest about whether institutionally there's a kind of centre of gravity in the BBC, I would say, and I don't think it's that surprising, really, that it probably is a bit centre left.
Can I push you on that as well? Because that's really interesting what you say there about the professionalism, if you like, people leaving their views at the door and not want to promote their views. One of the things I've heard recently, and this is not just about the BBC, but indeed across the board, is that things have changed now with a younger generation of people who don't necessarily want to promote their views, but they're very clear that they want certain views to be heard. And that makes things more difficult in newsrooms these days. Is that a fair characterisation?
I think it is. I think that's happening, and I think one of the things that happened with the BBC, and it sounds like a technical thing, so it's kind of a bit of a bore, but it's true, is that because of the amount of cuts they had to make back at the beginning of this decade in 2021, they introduced a massive reorganisation, which effectively tore out the heart of the sort of institutional memory of the BBC. Loads and loads of people who were sort of managers or on their way to becoming managers, probably, or senior, their jobs were sort of done away with, and that meant that there was sort of a group of very senior managers, and then a younger sort of cohort of actual journalists, and you lost the people in the middle who might be able to guide you. No, that edit should perhaps be done in a different way, or you shouldn't choose that. Or have you thought about the other angle on the story? As an editor at the BBC, that's what I was doing all the time. We always talked about things, and that was part of the role. If you take that away, then you leave. And you sort of, and it dovetails with the moment where there is this sort of feeling of a generation that has certain views they think are sort of almost articles of faith rather than just an opinion.
Okay,
that's quite a bad combination.
And just very finally, Rob, just on the future of the BBC, how serious do you think this is, more generally? And also, is it fair to say that being Director General of the BBC is too big a job for one person?
Well, it is huge. I mean, that's a good point. I mean, I don't know how they might need to think about how they support that role. There used to be a Deputy Director General back in the day, but for me, I really hope it's a moment of opportunity for the BBC to find the right people to lead it forward and to be muscular about impartiality. Deal with these concerns. Be strong with those people that work there, and say everyone should almost. You wonder whether everyone should walk in that door and they have to sign a piece of paper that pledges that they will not promote their own worldview while they're doing their journalism. You could call it maybe the JK pledge or the rolling pledge or something like that. It might catch on, but that's the kind of it has to be no doubt that the BBC is impartial, because without that impartiality, it's sunk.
Okay, Rob, we appreciate your time. Thank you very much indeed. Well, let's wrap this all up with Gita Harry, Sonia Stoddard and Rob Powell, who are all with me. Institutionally biased. I think that's probably the most or the gravest allegation today. What do you reckon? Are they institutionally biased?
Yeah, I come back to on certain issues, there is a bias, there is a lean. And the problem is it's on the most contested issues, not the least contested issues. So it is sex and gender.
Is this a left-wing, right-wing thing, or is that kind of too almost basic these days?
Well, yes, I think there is an element of that, because I think, again, if you take the issue of sex and gender, there was this sort of left-wing orthodoxy for a number of years that prevailed, which was that if you didn't agree to the idea that people should be able to self-identify into spaces that are normally reserved for people of the opposite sex, you were some sort of bigot, which is a ridiculous thing to argue, because there are plenty of people who think that, including left-wing feminists like me. But that was a very liberal elite orthodoxy, and it gripped a lot of institutions. But I think it did grip the BBC too. And I think there is something there too. I would agree with Rob that although if you were to do a sort of poll of staff, it would probably show left-leaning, on lots of stuff they are impartial. I think on these very kind of culture war issues, that's where the weakness really shines through.
Now, we talked about you working for the BBC, but you also work for some man who's been quite vocal about this, particularly in recent days, but was when he was Prime Minister, of course, that is Boris Johnson. He definitely thinks it's institutionally biased. You've seen maybe both sides of the curtain. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I think, it's almost as simple as saying there's a majority of people in News England Affairs who would go for The Guardian rather than the Daily Mail. And that is a sort of default. that leans to the left. But I think, to be fair, most of the people you'd see on television would challenge that, and they would, hold themselves to a higher standard where they don't reflect that. So it's more
because
the
there's
sort
an
of
argument
agenda
here
than in the reportage.
Because not to emphasise this too much, but the counter-argument to the BBC's left wing is that if you look at like Craig Oliver, if you look at yourself, if you look at Robbie Gibb, I mean, lots of these people have actually gone off and worked for Conservatives.
You've named all of us now. There's 20,000 people at the BBC, so of course there are exceptions. But I think somebody like Chris Mason, the current political editor, is untouchable. Laura Koonsberg before him. I genuinely would not know how they vote. And in the 18 years I was there, 4 parties thought I was on their side and 4 parties thought I was against them, depending on who they were and all that. So, and that is the deal. So when I realised, which during the Gulf War, when Tony Blair backed George Bush into taking us to Iraq, I did not want to be unbiased anymore. I wanted to go out there and scream, this is a bad idea, this is immoral, illegal. And I realised that it was time to leave the BBC, because you can't have your own agenda and take advantage of this huge privilege that you are allowed into the living room of everyone.
OK, Rob, let's turn to a bigger point here, because, not to use the terrible cliche, but this couldn't come at a worse time for the BBC. And that is true to the degree that we've got this big discussion over the next year or so about the charter renewal, about whether the BBC should continue in what form, and most certainly how it should be funded.
Yeah, the current charter runs out at the end of 2027. And the Charter, is the BBC's constitution. It tells the BBC how it's governed, its accountability, its mission, and as you suggest, importantly, its funding. Now, Lisa Nandy, the Culture Secretary, had already talked about possibly considering other models, different models of funding. Actually, I was reading an interview Tim Davie gave earlier this year when he said something else might be more relevant to, if anything, cut the sort of grinding level of cuts that the BBC's experienced recently. And I think to go back to the sort of discussion around the politics you have earlier, you can only imagine where this discussion would be if you had Conservatives in power, or indeed this was pushed back a few years and you had the potential of a reform government negotiating this as well. But I think the reason why sagas like this don't help is that if you are wanting to maintain a publicly funded system, a licence fee, you need public trust and faith in the BBC more broadly. If that starts to ebb away, as it has been generally just for all big institutions, then the argument for a licence fee ebbs away as well. So I think this is where it feeds into a more existential question about the BBC, what role it can play, it should play in a polarised world where people are getting news from elsewhere. What's the role for the BBC in that?
And that's why the Donald Trump thing is so damaging, because the argument for the BBC is, in that polarised world, you need a trusted source that is unpartisan and reliable. So to have Donald Trump sort of accuse you of fake news and be right on this occasion.
He's got a point, yeah.
It's sort of, he is bound to rights that was a misleading piece of reportage.
People would say you couldn't have something like BBC Verify if you're not necessarily able to verify kind of something on top. Just very briefly, because we've got about 30 seconds left on this, the problem for the BBC might be, and we've already seen this, people just not paying the licence fee.
Yes, and that may be a problem for the corporations. People just switch away from linear TV altogether. I think the BBC's got to make the case, because I think people feel like they have more choice now, and they might just want to subscribe to, streaming platforms, I won't name them, won't give them free advertising, instead of paying their licence fee and, using their TV. So the BBC is facing more competition in that sense than it ever has before.
And Gito, I said earlier on that we see this tag BBC crisis seemingly almost... I mean, you have to remember, like, every 10 years we seem to see a resignation of a Director General. How serious is this one?
I think this one is serious because the issue is one of trust, and the issue is one of objectivity, and the issue is one that goes to the heart of what the BBC is there for, to provide a trustworthy, objective view of the world. When others are rightly, some channels opinionated, others, less responsible. So that's why it's serious. And there's a question about who would want the job now, because it's also a bit of a nightmare.
OK, indeed, yes. Rob, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. And that story is obviously going to feature in tomorrow's papers. And we've got our extended press preview from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us will be the columnist at the Daily Mirror, Kelvin Maguire, and the Daily Mail's columnist, Sarah Vine. OK, you're watching The Politics Hub. Up next, we're going to bring you exclusive details of a row over £800,000 and your party with Zara Sultana and Jeremy Corbyn. We'll have all the details after the break. Stay tuned. Very welcome back. Now, donations being held by the MP Zara Sultana will be transferred over to your party, which was set up with Jeremy Corbyn in July, in tranches we hear this week. That's according to Sky News, and it follows a major row over finances behind the scenes. What I'd like to say, the person who brought us that story, and will do, is our reporter, Faye Brown. Faye, very good evening to you. Just first of all, I think remind lots of viewers, because they've forgotten, who are your party?
Yes, so Your Party is the new left-wing movement that was launched in July by Jeremy Corbyn, who lots of people will know is the former Labour leader, and Zara Sultana, who was a Labour MP until recently. She quit in protest at the direction of the party, and she joined forces with Jeremy Corbyn to launch this new movement, which they really said would be an antidote to the rise of the right. This would be a party about public ownership, taxing the rich, you know, building council houses. This was a party that was really meant to appeal to people unhappy with the direction of Sir Keir Starmer's government. And lots of people might not have been tracking its progress since then, but what a lot of people might be aware of is they haven't really got off to a smooth start. You know, Your Party isn't even the official name. That is still to be decided. There's been internal rows over the membership launch, and now this latest stumbling block, a row over donations.
Yeah, it's definitely been a very difficult birth. And what's also fascinating about this, because I said lots of people haven't heard of this party, but a lot of people have, and they've actually given quite a lot of money, haven't they?
Yeah, that's right. So when your party launched in July, they launched a website and there was lots of excitement around this and people really keen to see this get off the ground, donated money. So around £800,000 was raised within 2 months or so. But what those people might not realise is your party still can't spend that money. It still doesn't have access to that money. And that's because that money went into a company called MOU Operations. And this company was only ever meant to be a holding vehicle until your party registered with the Electoral Commission. That happened at the end of September, but still there's been no transfer. And in order to really resolve this dispute, Zara Sultana stepped in and she took over MOU about 10 days ago. So she's the sole director and has sole control over this money. But still, no transfer has happened. And over the last week or so, that has led to some rather negative briefings against Zara Sultana. There's been suggestions that, you know, she is holding on to this for her sort of own gains and that there's some sort of deliberate delay. And today, her allies strongly deny that. They say that £600,000 will be transferred over in tranches, starting with a transfer this Wednesday, and that the rest will be sent over once the company's costs, expenses and liabilities are settled in full. Well, that has spooked some people who are not so trusting in Zara Sultana because they think she is essentially going to hold some of this money back in case there are any consequences of when she launched that unauthorised membership portal a few weeks ago, which has potentially opened the door to fines over data breaches, although on the surface, your party spokesperson is saying that they are completely focused on putting together a successful conference and they want Britain to have a sort of socialist alternative it so badly needs.
Indeed, Faye, thank you very much indeed for that. I mean, I don't even know where to start with this, Sonia.
Yeah, you think it sort of couldn't get worse with the disorganisational chaos and the fallouts of this new fledgling movement, and then it does. So it's quite crazy. I mean, to have this sort of dispute about this amount of money and have it in the control of one sole director is very dodgy, I think, given how much money that they've managed to raise by going out online, the fact that there didn't seem to be a plan worked out about who was going to control this money before they went out and did it. But you've got to remember that all the time this is going on, the Greens are riding high in the polls, and it would have been your party, whatever it was going to be called, that would be hoping to mop up those votes from disaffected left voters who are annoyed with Keir Starmer. And actually the polls make it look like it's all going to Zach Polanski's Greens. And I think it's going to be quite hard in some ways for this new party to get a look in because Zach Polanski is turning out to be quite a charismatic leader of
our
the
politics
Greens.
are clearly quite volatile at the moment.
True,
and Zara Sultana obviously is suggesting the money's coming back. And we shall see. Just briefly on this, though, I mean, we've seen political parties try and launch before and it's not worked. What's your instinct about this?
They clearly don't trust each other. The two people at the heart of this haven't trusted each other from the beginning. And the perception now, I would think, is that she is using this money as leverage to make sure that she can't be sidelined. And, you know, if they're playing games like that at this stage, then they're a long, long way from offering themselves as an alternative government.
Yes, I think that may well be true. Certainly a long way from an alternative government, Gito. I'm not denying you that one. I'm not denying that. Faye, thank you very much indeed. And you can read more about Faye's story on the Sky News website this evening. Thank you very much indeed. OK, coming up after the break. When do political jibes become more... Oh, we're not taking a break. Oh, because we've run out of time apparently. But we have got time for one more story. And that is... when do political jibes become more than just a bit of clowning around? Well, the Shadow Justice Secretary, Robert Jenrick, has faced criticism, with some saying he broke parliamentary rules for posting an artificially generated video of his opposite number, David Lammy, in which the Justice Secretary turns into a clown. Now, he posted the AI clip, which shows Mr. Lammy donning the circus outfit and makeup during PMQs to blast his handling of the accidental release of prisoners. Have a watch. Well, apparently we're not going to watch that because the video shows the Justice Secretary transforming from the side of the dispatch box to him suddenly changing on the floor of the House, basically so that he's dressed as a clown. Now, we're not going to show you the video because there are very strict rules about showing anything that plays or messes around with the feed from the Houses of Parliament. But earlier, the Shadow Cultural Secretary, Nigel Huddleston, did defend the Shadow Justice Secretary.
I think the way that we use images we've got to be careful about, and there's also rights issues around here, but there's often been a culture where we allow mockery of some sort, and fair use is often used as a reason here. I think if it was trying to portray something or give the impression of a speech or something and then deep fake, that would be one thing. But clearly, quite frankly, taking the mickey out of something is slightly different, and I think the British culture is usually quite tolerant about those kind of things.
Well, we had a bit of clarity around, didn't we, there in the last minute or so, trying to get into that story. You've seen this video. What do you think?
I think it's fair enough. Okay. I mean, it's quite obviously sort of doctored. It's kind of quite funny. It's a little bit cheap, a little bit, you know, well, not nasty, but a little bit cheap, but it's fine. All's fair in love, war and politics, I think.
Because remember, his nickname is, Robert Jenrick's name is Calamity Lammy. What do you reckon? I mean, the reason we can't show it is because there are genuine rules about the feed from the House of Parliament and stuff. But also politicians should be able to kind of...
So I think the thing that sort of puts it in a different category to other AI or fake news is that it's very clear it's not real because, I mean, the guy is donning a clown costume in the House of Commons.
Red nose and all.
Yes, exactly. So it's clear that it's fake and it's having a bit of a laugh. The one thing I will say about Robert Jenrick is that he is very good at doing these things that make us sit around and talk about him. So this isn't the first time that he's attracted a lot of media attention because he's done something quite clever, maybe not sophisticated, but, you know, clever with social media. So, you know, maybe there is something to be said for that, I suppose. We are dancing to his tune.
And while you said it and you said it's funny and, you know, I don't think we should be too po-faced about politics, but the concern obviously is, I mean, AI is going one way, which is making it even more realistic. I mean, that's the real concern here, is that we do end up in this world, don't we?
Yeah, and you've made the point that this works because it's obvious, I think. But if you get to the point where, you know, it's not obvious and certain words are coming out of the mouth of somebody who looks perfectly normal otherwise, that's where AI can get very, very dangerous. And that's, again, back to where we started the programme, you need trusted news sources that are reliable and don't do the doctoring themselves.
Well, that was a beautiful full circle.
Very good, very good. Just finally on this, what's your sense about the kind of the Parliament itself? Because, as I say, one of the reasons we're not allowed to show it is because the rules around what happens in the chamber are not. But it is important to keep kind of the secrecy of Parliament, is it, do you reckon?
I mean, I actually haven't seen the video, so it's a little bit hard to comment on it without it, I suppose. I sort of think that, you know, if it's obviously a joke, I do think the public tend to be quite tolerant of this. And, you know, I don't share any of Robert Jenrick's politics, but I think efforts to bring humour into politics are not necessarily a bad thing because, you know, it makes more people sit up and listen.
And if he's censored for this, if he's actually disciplined for doing this, we'll all be talking about it for longer and longer, you know, mission accomplished.
It may be that old adage of all publicity is good publicity when it comes to it.
I'm sure that is what Robert Jenrick thinks.
I have to say, you're very right in the sense that he is very good, some might say better than the leader, at generating noise around stories that he wants to talk about. Sonia, Gita, thank you very much indeed for joining us tonight. Up next, it is the UK Tonight with Sarah J. May. Join us tomorrow night at 7. Goodbye.